not funny, but very informative. Yeah. So, all right, friends.
Whether you're a reader or not, we're here to engage with this book.
Yeah, glad that you're with us and reading Scripture and listening and engaging the text. And we are engaging the text today in Romans chapter 7, I think verse 7. Is that correct?
I believe so.
So we continue our discussion on law and sin, mostly on sin, but Paul has circled back around to pick up some of the themes we saw earlier in the book already, and he revisits conversation about law. So verse 7 here. What then should we say? That the law is sin? No, by no means. Yet, if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. I would have not known what it is to covet if the law had said, you shall not covet. But sin, seizing the opportunity in the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. Apart from apart from the law, sin lies dead. Let's stop there. So, again, Paul is making the case not that the law is bad, not that the law is useless, not that the law should be discarded or doesn't matter, but that the law is not a recipe for becoming righteous. In fact, the law really can only serve the function of showing us how unrighteous we are. And this is what he says, is the law sin? No, the law is not sin, but the law points out sin and therefore makes us conscious of it. When we hear the law, do not covet, we realize that we're guilty of coveting. We realize that we are a lawbreaker, and sin, this is a great verse, verse 8, sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. I think these words are maybe especially poignant or applicable if you, like me as a child, were inclined to just because do the opposite of what someone told you. These words make sense to you. As soon as you hear do not, you're thinking, I'm going to do it. And not everybody is wired that way, but I think Paul's point is that everybody can have some sense of the argument here. When the law draws a line, now we realize that there is another side. There is sin, there is disobedience on the other side of that line. And so the law makes us aware of sin and simultaneously convicts us of it.
Yeah, you would have to have joined us for some of these preceding conversations for this to really make sense in its context, because you got to remember we went all the way back to Adam and jumped before Abraham and this idea of the person who has faith, right? And then we have Moses, the one who gives the law. So what we have here is Paul making this extended argument that essentially thus far we've said that there is a distinction between sin and law, that sin existed before the law, and then the law was given. And this is a way of talking about the differences between those who are law people, the people of Israel, and those who are not the law people. And now what we have here is this really interesting sort of theological statement based upon the implication that the law is unto itself not a reflection of sin. The law is not caught up in the stain of sin itself. The law merely functions as a thing that points to it. So they're similar, but not the same. And that distinction is absolutely essential to Paul because, and I would just sort of stretch this argument to the extreme, and check me on this, Clint, but what Paul is trying to argue against is that if the law itself is sinful, then the people of Israel and the practice that they've had, it too is now implicated in sin itself. In other words, them as a people, as he's separated these entities, they now bear some guilt that Paul is not theologically trying to argue that they have. His point is we're all sinners. saved by grace. The fact that they had the law didn't help them, but it didn't hurt them. It didn't put them in a more negative position because the Jews received the law. No, everybody's still implicated at the same level, and whether you're Jew or Gentile, it doesn't matter in terms of where you stand.
Yeah, I think, Michael, you could even go so far as to say that if the law is a partner with sin, then God is therefore implicated as the giver of the law.
Yeah.
And I think what Paul is arguing is that if the Jews, and I think he would make the case that they have understood that the law's task was to make them holy, they have misunderstood it. And he's going to argue instead that the law's task is to convince you that you can't be holy. The law's task is to convict you of your unrighteousness. And so let's just jump in here. Let's continue verse 9. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died, and the very commandment that promised life proved death to me. For sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. What does it mean? It means that when we sinned apart from the law, we did not know we were choosing disobedience. We were simply following ourselves. And then somehow we learned we should not do this. And now our disobedience becomes a willful act. It becomes a law-breaking act. And that then makes us guilty of sin. And when we are guilty of sin, we are on the path to death. And so this is Paul's logic here. I was alive when I didn't know anything, but as soon as I knew, then I was a sinner. And when I was a sinner, I was headed toward death because sin, again, listen to the language, seized an opportunity in the commandment and deceived me, and through the deceit, killed me. In other words, it was leading me to death. And so I know we're beating this, we're kind of beating this into the ground, and Paul very much does in the book of Romans. But the argument, in fact, we'll see it even as we finish up our reading today. The law for Paul is not at fault. The law convicts us of being at fault, and that is, he's going to argue, and has always been, its primary function.
Yeah, and I want to hone in here, end of verse 11. What does the power of sin in us do? It drives us ultimately to death. And that should perk up our ears, because we just a few days ago talked about what happens in Christ. We are baptized into his what? Into his death. And then it's on the other side of that we're raised to new life. What Paul is doing theologically is sophisticated in that his theological understanding of what God had done in the Old Testament, which would have been his scriptures, that's what he was taught and what he was an expert in. When he sees the life, death, resurrection of Jesus, he takes the pattern of that revelation and he sees that inscribed upon the history of God's interaction with God's people. And Paul comes to say, this is essentially what we understand about what God intended, that sin drove us to death. That is the end. That when you go down that road, you go down a non-creative, restorative, non-resurrection road. That at the end of the law, which has been enabled by sin, actually, I need to flip that. At the end of sin, which has been enabled by the law, you find death. But the Christian story, which we've already heard, we're going to hear again, we are intuiting is in the background a different kind of death. When we die with Christ, we're raised to a new life on the other side. That's what makes this language of death, life, resurrection, new life. All of these words are absolutely essential to Paul because it is the pattern of Jesus that defines everything else. And as people who celebrate Easter, it's a part of our growing up, even many of us from our very youngest memories, we might miss the force of how Paul fashions and models his entire thinking based upon Jesus' own story. And that's really what we see happening here.
to add to that, we can almost see, and we will, I think, see it unpacked. The law then also brings wrath. It cannot bring life, not because it's not worthy, but because we are not able. And in being unable to follow the law by definition brings us consequence, brings us punishment. It is not that the law is punishment. It is that when we measure ourselves against it, we are found guilty and deserving of punishment. So it's important to understand as we move into the next parts of the book here that the law brings wrath. Well, contrasted to that, what does Jesus bring? Jesus brings life. Jesus brings grace. Jesus brings forgiveness. And so the law can point us only toward punishment, the very punishment from which Jesus delivers us. So here we take a turn. In verse 12, we kind of turn and we finish this section, this passage here on a, I think, a pretty positive note. So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and just and good. Did what is good then bring death to me? No, by no means. It was sin working death in me through what is good, in order that sin might be shown to be sin, and through the commandment might become sinful beyond measure. So, again, what's the purpose of the law? To help us see sin, which it does. It is good. It is holy. It is just. And when we look in that holy, just, good mirror, we see our brokenness. We see our lack of measuring up. Is it the good that convicts us? No, it's sin that convicts us. But we see sin in comparison to good. And that's really all Paul is saying here. We don't understand bad until we look at good and therefore recognize our own sin. And when we do that, we are convicted. We are found to be in the wrong. And so what is good opens our eyes to what is not good in us.
And therein is one of the fundamental perspectives. That's not exactly the word I'm looking for. It is one of the core lenses of the gospel. The reality that when we see reflected in the law our brokenness, that it should inspire within us contrition and humility. From a Christian context, it's impossible to look at the depth of our sin sickness and to not be moved on our knees seeking grace. There is no Christian way to get to the other side of the reality of sin feeling good about ourselves, saying, oh yeah, I'm actually not that bad, all things considered. You know, it's actually better than I expected. That's never the movement of the gospel. It's always we realize the reality of death first. The hope and promise is that on the other side of that, by the grace and power of God, there's life and resurrection, that there's a new way beyond this way. And yet, Clint, so many Christians do exactly go the wrong direction. They see the law and they turn it outward as like a bright, shining light of sin detecting in everybody else, right? That temptation to say, hey, look at how sinful you are. And I don't think that movement lies close at the heart of the gospel. That movement reflects our own arrogance and pride and an unwillingness to allow the law to reflect what is true. We haven't heard what Paul's saying. If we're quick to judge our neighbor, it's not that our neighbor may not stand in judgment, but they stand in judgment of God. And the worry in that is, so do I. And that's the account that we should be concerned about.
There's a sense in which our language and the words that we gravitate toward hurt us. You know, in English, we're comfortable with the words good and bad, but those are not equivalents of the biblical words, say righteous and sinful. Those words for Paul, holy and unholy, that's not a dial. That's a switch. It is holy or it is not. And in English, when we use the words good and bad, we think more in terms of a percentage. Well, I'm more good than I am bad. That's more bad than it is good. But that's not the biblical picture here. That could be a conversation about sanctification maybe and what it means to be a disciple, but it is not a part of the conversation of holiness and sinfulness, because for Paul, any sin negates all holy. So if we cannot argue that we are holy if there is any sin within us, and for Paul, the blessing of the law is it's going to irreversibly show us the truth that there is in fact sin in us, which is necessary in order to get us to the point of asking, well then what is my hope, right? If my hope is not in the law, it's not in my goodness, it's not in my ability to make the right choices and do the right things, then for the love of God, what is my hope? Where is my possibility, my chance? What chance do I have? And when Paul gets us there, which he will in about a chapter, then we're asking the right question. He's led us exactly where he wants us to be.
It's interesting as you say that, Clint. I would not have considered it, but there's a sense in which that Paul is here also giving us a framework to understand how we show ourselves to others. The idea that the law makes it clear that the emperor has no clothes, right? I mean, we become as those who recognize what is true. And that truth is maybe a difficult thing to grapple with, but as we do so, it strips from us this need to put on false fronts, to become these, as Jesus called, ivory tombs, right? We become people who are not wrapped up in the image that we project, but rather the reality of being saved by grace. And I think that there's something powerful as I reflect upon the saints that I've had the privilege of getting to see live in the faith. They get to live with a kind of open freedom. They neither need to hide their wounds, nor do they need to walk with their wounds clearly displayed for all to see. There's a beautiful balance in the life that has recognized the truth of the law, the truth of, friends, we are all wounded in deep and significant ways, irreversible ways, Paul would say. But by the grace of Christ, it has been resurrected. We found on the other side of irreversible harm good by the power of God. And so on that other side, I wonder if we might all strive to live with that same kind of freedom and balance, a kind of tension between the recognition we do stand as those accused who stand in the light of the one who has forgiven. And that is, as we always say, an eternal thanks be to God.
Yeah, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but essentially, one cannot accept grace until one acknowledges they are guilty. You cannot receive grace until you admit that you need it. And admitting you need it means you have to admit you don't deserve it. And Paul, you may not realize yet that Paul is taking us on this journey, but Paul has been very methodically taking us step by step to have just that conversation. We're not quite there yet. Monday we'll move into what I think is one of the most fascinating parts of the letter. It's generated lots of conversation through the centuries about what it means, what it doesn't mean, what Paul's trying to do in this. It's, I would call it a masterful sermon illustration of sorts, and I think that Paul is going to show us on Monday and probably Tuesday one of the real gems of this letter. There are many, but I would consider these next verses some of them.
That said, we look forward to seeing you on Monday. Before that, we hope to see you for worship, wherever that is in our sanctuary, Facebook or YouTube. We look forward to having you worship with us on Sunday. And then 2 o'clock on Monday, we'll be back.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome! We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally, but be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.